Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to welcome to the show journalist John Walters from the Vermont Political Observer. So glad you can be here this week, John.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I'm intrigued for today's conversation because we have some things from your blog that we're going to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you and I, when we've been talking a lot lately, have been really looking at the state of media. So I think or Vermont media, and I think some of what we're going to talk about today will feed into that. The other thing I'm interested in with today's conversation is, now that we're in a natural lull in the political process, I've been asking myself, okay, looking ahead between now and January when the session starts again, what do I need to give and what do I need to bring to listeners to help them either understand what just happened in the 2025 session or get ready for the 2026 session? How can I serve my listeners the best? And it's a little interesting right now because everyone's like, I don't want to frickin' think about the session. Like, I'm done.
It was pretty exhausting.
It was the session that really did not want to end.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping today that today's conversation will kind of touch on some of those themes. So speaking of 2026, you've been doing some reporting lately on the political process, particularly campaign financing filings, and who may run for governor in 2026, which is a very big umbrella for things to fit under. But let's start with the campaign finance filings.
Mm-hmm.
You've been following Lieutenant Governor John Rogers and his campaign. And I think it's interesting because I'll let you jump in a second, John, but I think this is one of those issues that on the surface, I think it would be very easy for audience members to say, why should we care? And yet it does touch on deeper issues of what do we expect from our politicians?
Yeah.
And what do we expect them to be able to do or achieve or care about, like the rule of law, when we elect them. So, John, bring us up to speed on the Lieutenant Governor's finance filings that you first reported on in December 2024.
Yeah. He had a campaign that started from zero, literally zero, at the beginning of July, and raised a whole bunch of money, I think, on the back of Phil Scott campaigning heavily on his behalf for lieutenant governor, and a lot of Republican donors deciding that he was a worthwhile bet. So he raised a lot of money.
In 2024.
In 2024.
Okay.
He, when he filed his final report a couple of weeks after the election, he reported spending, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but it was about raising about $215,000 and spending about 268 or something like that. The difference was, I may have those figures slightly wrong. The difference between the two is over $60,000.
Well, actually, I think it was over $68,000.
Yeah, it was,
according to my notes. Yeah,
it was a lot of money, and it raised a question in my mind: if he spent that much more than he raised, he's got a massive debt to pay off, and is he going to have to solicit further contributions while he's lieutenant governor? That's supposed to be kind of a no-no. It put him seemingly in a compromising position, or a compromised position. Several weeks later, 7 Days reporter finally covered this story, and he talked to Rogers and to his campaign manager, State Representative Casey Toof, and Toof explained that they didn't really spend that much money. They mistakenly double reported a couple of large expenditures, and they were confused by the filing process. And Rogers complained that it was too difficult to follow. To which my response is, Crimea River, everybody has to follow it, so figure it out. If you can't figure that out, you probably shouldn't be governor, and maybe not even lieutenant governor. Anyway, so Casey Toof said there's a simple explanation. We made a couple of mistakes, and time went on, and nothing more was said about it. Somebody from the Vermont Democratic Party actually filed a complaint with the Attorney General over Rogers' campaign finances. We do not know where that has gone, if anywhere. The Attorney General tends not to take a strong arm in enforcing these laws, and she's kind of got her hands full with Donald Trump. But anyway, there was no reporting on this. The July 1st deadline which is the first campaign finance deadline for the 2026 season.
So that would have been July 1st, 2025.
Right, this summer. Okay. That came and went, and John Rogers did not file a report as required by law. He still has not. And he still has not corrected the reportedly very simple mistakes in his 2024 filing. It wouldn't take them very long to file an amended final report, and they just haven't bothered to do it. And that, to me, reflects a pretty cavalier attitude toward the law. This isn't really serious. If Casey Toof is telling the truth, then there's no funny business going on, and John Rogers is not in debt, or his campaign is not in debt. So fine. But the law is there for a reason, and if there's going to be a law, you ought to follow it. Just like if you're driving down a road where the speed limit's 35 and you think you can go 50 safely, then you'd still better go 35. Or at least 40. It strikes me as unbecoming of someone who is our second in command and heartbeat away from the governorship, and who is widely expected at some point to run for governor. I think we ought to expect more from our highest office holders.
And I'm sorry, I don't know this, John, but what are the consequences for him not filing or not fixing this error?
Well, funny you should ask. The people who wrote the campaign finance laws and set the penalties are office holders who have to abide by the system.
There's that.
They very cleverly set up a system with rules and deadlines and guidelines and pretty much no penalties. And the Secretary of State's office or the Attorney General's office, their basic approach to enforcing these laws is not so much to enforce them as to remind candidates of their obligations, and kind of hope that will do the job. And if John Rogers filed his reports tomorrow, the Attorney General would close the case. So it's a simple thing to take care of, I would think.
Yes. Well, I think what this reminds me of a little bit is, I think of municipal reporting where a select board member or maybe a town clerk or a town manager has made a similar mistake. And quite often it is just that. It's a mistake. There's no funny business. There's no malicious intent.
Yeah.
And yet the expectation for them to remedy that mistake can often be quite low. And on one hand, I understand that, because one of the things I love about our system is technically anyone can run for office.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Um, Pretty much anyone can run for select board, put their hand up for town clerk, that type of thing. And I love that about our system. The downside, however, is it doesn't just because someone runs for office doesn't mean they have the skill set to run that office well, to manage select board meetings well, that type of thing. And unfortunately, I feel sometimes in an attempt, I see this especially with the public document right to know laws, open meeting laws. We want to give folks who are not professionals um, the leeway to make mistakes. And yet, I think sometimes in that good, well meaning effort, it creates squishiness where
Mhm.
then it's like, eh, so what if something from 2024 wasn't filed properly? So what if we missed a July 1 deadline? Um, and that I think just weakens the system across the board.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's why we've got state police in the, median of the freeway, doing a radar check on people going by.
Hmm.
Um, except that they actually write tickets instead of just, waving their finger at the driver.
Yeah, there are actual consequences to speeding where there may not be actual consequences to
Yeah.
you know being a scofflaw with Vermont finance law.
And in a lot of ways, our government from the town level to the even the state legislature is still a holdover from the days when we didn't really expect government to do a whole lot.
Mm,
It was small, it handled very little money, and the consequences for, mistakes or whatever were not that great. And now we have much higher expectations of what our government is going to do. And, the system it's working okay for the most part, but it's not really set up for the demands of the 21st century.
the
Uh,
complexities.
we saw that recently there was a story about the fact that, last year the legislature extended the state ethics commission's purview to include local government. And that didn't mean enforcement. They don't have enforcement powers, but it does mean taking complaints and referring them to other agencies and also receiving requests for ethics advice from local office holders. And, there are a lot of earnest people in local office who just don't know exactly what they should and shouldn't do. Um, but at the same time, the legislature expanded the ethics commission's remit, but they didn't appropriately expand the resources for the
Mm,
ethics commission. So the
hmm.
commission had to effectively stop considering complaints or requests for ethics advice from local governments or local residents. So that's another way in which we often try to get by with government on the cheap, and occasionally we pay the price for it.
It's a good point. It's a very good point. Talk to me a little bit about the 2026 campaign.
Mm.
You've been, actually, no, I want to go back for a second because about the time you were writing about John Rogers, I think it was, I think I saw the story in Digger. If I've got that wrong, I apologize. About Becca Ballant and her PAC and corporate funding and everything like that, and how Becca has said, I will not take corporate funding.
Right.
And this article kind of was questioning that with
Well,
some of, so I guess my question is what's the difference between, or are they completely different? Should we be putting John Rogers and Becca Balance funding snafus in the same category, or
yeah. Well, ballot is not in violation of the law. Uh,
that
and
is a difference?
and she has reported everything as required by law, and that's why Digger was able to write this story. Um,
Fair enough.
what she has done, as many politicians do, Peter Welch does, Bernie Sanders does, they have their own campaign fund, and they have what they call a leadership pack, which is they gather money and help support other candidates. It can help a lot if somebody with the fundraising power of Bernie Sanders has money, has a pot of money that he can give to, like-minded Democratic Socialist candidates elsewhere.
Hmm.
It also is a way of raising your level of influence in Congress if you have resources that you can share with your fellow members or with, aspiring members.
Hmm.
What Becca Ballant has done, she has made a lot of noise about not accepting corporate contributions. And she does not accept any corporate contributions to her own campaign fund. But she has accepted a small amount of money from a few corporations for her leadership pack,
Hmm.
which that money then is funneled on to like-minded candidates, not to her. So, Digger pounced on this as Ballant kind of being hypocritical. And in a way, she kind of is. She's making a big deal about not accepting corporate contributions, and she's not, but she's treating her own leadership pack differently.
Right.
And one could argue Bernie Sanders doesn't make that distinction. He does not accept corporate money for either.
Hmm.
Um, one could make the argument that Becca Ballant is being a little bit hypocritical here, that she is not as consistent as, say, Bernie is with her principle. Um, that might be true. I don't think it's particularly scandalous. If she had raised a huge amount of money from corporations, if she'd gotten like $1 billion from Elon Musk or something, then that would be different. I think the total amount of corporate money was something like $13,000.
Right, yeah.
So it's a small point. Um, it is not in any sense illegal. Um, you can, to me, it was Digger kind of making a mountain out of a molehill. And the fact that Digger has never even once written about John Rogers' campaign finance, is kind of a striking contrast to me.
Hmm.
Uh, so, that's how I feel about that. Your mileage may vary.
Well, thank you. Since they did come out at the same time, your story and Diggers, I think it's an interesting question to ask yourself is like, what's the difference,
Yeah.
if any? Okay, so circling back to the 2026 campaign, it's something you've been watching
Hmm.
and you've been wondering who the Dems will put forward.
Yes.
And I'm curious, why is this grabbing your attention right now?
Well, I mean, they have been struggling with this since 2017. You know, they have not, none of their top office holders have chosen to challenge Phil Scott. So we have had a series of candidates who were worthy in their own rights and had credentials to offer, but didn't have anywhere near the statewide visibility or name recognition or track record or fundraising prowess required to take on an incumbent governor. So, people like Christine Hallquist and Brenda Siegel, they were not bad candidates. They just were severely, restricted in what they could accomplish,
Mhm.
and they had basically no chance to beat Phil Scott. So the Democrats have had this problem where they really haven't mounted a serious challenge to Phil Scott, which means that he basically goes unchallenged in terms of his agenda and his accomplishments. Nobody's really, seriously put him to the test since 2016. Um, so it's, I am the most crucial question for the Vermont Democrats for next year is, are they going to be able to find a candidate for governor who can compete? And to me, that's a very short list. It includes, the three Democratic statewide office holders, Attorney General, Treasurer, and Secretary of State. Um, and perhaps you could argue former Lieutenant Governor Molly Gray. Um,
Hmm.
and that's about it, unless you got a real shocker move like Becca Balint suddenly, relinquishing her seat in Congress to run for governor or something like that. There was talk, I think, 4 years ago of Peter Welch doing that, and
Hmm.
didn't. Um, so, there are those three, and they are the only three who have anything like a shot to put up a decent challenge to Phil Scott. And they kind of need to get an early start because they've got to raise a lot of money
Good
and
point.
start increasing their public profile. I mean, uh, Attorney General Charity Clark has increased her public profile by joining multi-state lawsuits against Donald Trump. Um, Treasurer Mike Pichak has spent a lot of time and energy, raising his public profile by, starting initiatives and making lots and lots of appearances and making lots of public statements. He's appeared at gatherings large and small, almost wherever anybody will offer an invitation. Um, but so, you know, the question is, will any of these three actually take the plunge and run for governor, not knowing at this point whether Phil Scott will seek a sixth term? Um, and, recently Secretary of State Sarah Copeland Hanses took her name out of the running by announcing very early that she was going to run for reelection. Um, and so that kind of leaves two.
Hmm.
And, whether again, if they choose to wait until Phil Scott makes his move, then they are going to block the path for anyone else to try to mount a serious challenge to the governor. So, and all this changes radically if the governor decides to retire.
Right.
But we don't know that, and he has made it clear that he won't make any announcement official until the end of the legislative session next year.
Hmm.
And that's way too late for anybody to start a campaign.
Fair. Very fair.
So
Um,
that's why I'm watching it.
well, and I think you bring up a very good point. One of the great things about challenged elections, so often in Vermont we have unchallenged elections,
Mm-hmm.
and the incumbent runs and nobody runs against them in the primary or the general,
Mm-hmm.
and people just keep moving forward. But one of the great things about a challenged election in my book is, as you said, it's really how we as the voters get to vet a lot of the issues and where our leaders stand on issues. Yes, Governor Scott has his press releases, and yes, he has his press conferences, but he's not being challenged on his positions in the same way he would be during an election. And so, yeah, that's a whole bunch of new information for people to consider.
And there's not a lot of, I mean, his press conferences are much less well attended than they used to be because the press corps is so much smaller.
Hmm.
There's a lot less of a likelihood that he will be closely questioned. I can remember when Peter Shumlin was governor and the press corps was much larger. And you would kind of occasionally during one of these press conferences get a feeding frenzy where,
Mm.
reporters would follow up on a previous answer that seemed a little fishy. And, you kind of sometimes get this one reporter after another piling on and exploring a key point and putting the politician on the office holder on the spot.
Hmm.
And there just isn't a critical mass of reporters at these things anymore for anything. I've seen press conferences with Phil Scott that kind of started winding down about 25 minutes into it. And that included 10 or 15 minutes of whatever, puffery announcement he was making. Um, there just aren't that many questions. Usually reporters come in with a question they want to ask
Hmm.
and they don't think of anything else. There's much less follow up than there used to be. And so, the press conferences are not are much less likely to shed light on something that the governor doesn't want exposed.
Mm,
Um, and, the Democrats are severely hamstrung in this regard because, when they call press conferences, nobody shows up. When the governor holds a press conference, it's automatically news. There's something that will, feature on the TV news and
right.
usually will be written up by at least some of the print media.
Hmm.
But when the Democrats hold a press conference, Democratic, legislative leadership more or less gave up on holding press conferences because they got little to no turnout, and the reporters who did turn out may or may not write a story about it
Hmm.
unless
Interesting.
they saw more substance than, Democrats strike back at governor or Democrats unveil policy proposal or something like that. So
Hmm.
there's an imbalance which is made even worse by the fact that our media is so much smaller than it used to be.
Well, on that note, we need to hear from some underwriters here on WVEW, LP Brattleboro. But John Walters from the Vermont Political Observer and I will return in a moment. Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. I'm Olga Peters, your host and producer, and I have been speaking with journalist John Walters, who is the force behind the Vermont Political Observer. And in the first half of the show, we were talking a little bit about campaigns and campaign finance, but I think what it really boiled down to was sort of the rule of law and who's actually paying attention to the rule of law, which will feed us into the second half of the show where we're going to be talking a little bit more about local media, which has been an issue that John and I have been really interested in lately. Before I do that, a couple housekeeping things. I want to thank BCTV for taking the video version of the show and sharing it with media centers around the state. John, do you remember what we have to remind listeners of?
The opinions and views expressed by the host and guest on this program are their own and nobody else's, and especially not any of the entities that carry this program. So they are not responsible for anything that we say.
I like your use of the word entities. That was a nice little flourish on the regular what is it called? A warning or a
Disclaimer.
disclaimer. There we go.
Well,
Um,
I've been writing about media a lot, which means I have to open up the thesaurus a little bit and come up with new ways of saying organization or company or whatever. So entity is sort of when I'm tired of writing organization or outlet, then I will slip in an entity once in a while.
I like it. I like it. It's got some pizzazz. Before we jump into talking about media, I just want to let folks know that next week, Representative Christopher Morrow will be on the show, and he represents the Windham Windsor Bennington district, which I'm looking forward to hearing. He's a newbie in the state house. This was his first session, as far as I know, and I'm interested to hear his thoughts on the session. But I'm also curious. I don't know about you, John, but we have such strong identities as towns
Mhm.
and I think counties a little bit in Vermont that I'm wondering from his point of view, what's it like to represent basically towns from three different counties. So looking forward to hearing that. And then the week after Christopher, Representative Leslie Goldman will be on the show again, wrapping up our conversation around the 2025 session and her thoughts on what happened in the session. And for those who don't know, she represents Wyndham 3. And so without further ado, hey, John, what's scaring you about local media this week?
Well, I mean, there is a basic fact behind all of this talk, and it is that, you know, over the last quarter century, roughly, Vermont has lost 75% of its journalism jobs.
Mm-hmm.
a lot of entities, a lot of outlets have disappeared or gotten drastically smaller than they used to be. We talked at the end of the first half of the show about the tremendously declined number of reporters hanging around the State House and attending press conferences. Um, there just are way fewer bodies, at the State House, at cities and towns, covering town meetings. You're lucky if you have a reasonably good local newspaper that publishes once a week, that can cover those meetings. But there's just not a lot of bodies, and there's not nearly as much news coverage as there used to be. And I don't think we are aware of how much we have lost
Mm,
and how much we may be missing
hmm
in terms of the stories that are not being covered because either nobody finds them or it's too difficult to dig them out. It takes too much time. And reporters who are lucky enough to have jobs at all are very much pressed for time. They need to produce stuff quickly and in quantity. And that means a lot less in depth reporting,
Yeah.
which every time a news organization makes a cutback, they say, we're refocusing our efforts in order to do more in depth reporting. And they never, ever, ever mean it. They're just trying to get by with less.
hmm
So, that's the basis for all this. And I've found myself in recent weeks writing more and more about Vermont media because there are great outlets in this state, including some very, you know, uh, under-resourced, scrappy, local papers like the Commons in Brattleboro and the Chester Telegraph and, the Hardwick Gazette. I like to think I'm on their board, so I'm not an uninterested party there. The Bridge in Montpelier, uh,
Mm,
7 days, and 7 days has shrunk a lot from what it used to be, but they are still doing a good job of covering their community.
yeah.
And there are a lot of good, local papers all across this state who all could use more help. But there's a lot of good stuff out there. But at the same time, just the quantity just isn't there. And I think that's especially true of state government and state politics. We have seen VT Digger, whose original purpose was to cover state politics and state policy. They have spread their resources around. They've had to make cutbacks, and they have spread their resources around to the point where they have reporters in several different areas of the state. Um, they just started a new initiative called Dirt Road News, which is meant to try to extend their reach more into local communities around the state and rural communities and young people, who are underserved and are under consumers of news frequently. Um, so Digger is trying to spread itself out, even as they have had to, cut back on their total number of resources, which means their attention to state government is a lot less than it used to be. And I don't like that as a reader of Digger and as a monthly contributor to Digger, but that's the choice they've made. Um, the fact overall, though, is that we are desperately short of news coverage pretty much everywhere in Vermont. And various news organizations are trying to reinvent themselves, many of them as nonprofits. The Commons was a pioneer in the nonprofit realm. But I've been reading a lot about this. I'm on the Hardwick Gazette board, which means I have a personal and professional interest in this question. And what I found is that there are a lot of very creative people, very energetic, very dedicated people everywhere, including many of them in Vermont, who are really trying their best to reinvent journalism. And so far, nobody's found the magic bullet. And everybody is trying to find a way. And I feel fairly optimistic that there is a way. Um, I think it's going to be hard. I think there are obstacles and there are difficulties, and success is not assured. I think we are going to have to, like on the local level, outlets like the Chester Telegraph and the Hardwick Gazette and the Montpelier Bridge, et cetera, the Commons, are going to have to make the case to their readers that public radio has been able to make to their listeners, which is that if you depend on this service, you're going to have to provide some measure of support for it, even if it's a small amount. That's a challenge. That's a new skill set that most print journalists don't have.
So
So
true.
it's uh, it's 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 a struggle, but it's a struggle worth fighting for.
Hmm.
Um, and if I can play a small part in making the Gazette sustainable and maybe even providing something of an example for other small papers, then that would be something I could be very proud of. I talked a lot there, didn't I?
You did, but it was good because the refrigerator started making very strange noises. So I appreciated being able to mute my microphone.
And you were worried about the cat that you're pet sitting.
I know, right? I'm worried about the cat making weird noises, and no, the refrigerator took off. Um, yeah, it's so interesting with news that I this is a conversation the Commons has had very often. You know, just for those who may not be familiar with the Commons, we try to focus all on Windham County. Um, Unfortunately, we don't always have the reporters to get to all the towns we'd like to.
Yeah.
Brattleboro, because I would say Brattleboro and Bellows Falls, because they have the concentration of population, tend to get the most coverage. Um, and the Commons operates as a nonprofit weekly. It does not offer subscriptions, at least the last time I checked. And it's free. You can pick it up at drop spots all over the county, and even a little bit, I think, over in Bennington, Keene, New Hampshire, and Greenfield, Mass as well. And a lot of folks will say, well, if you need more money, just charge subscriptions and don't have the free drops, which is a perfectly good economic argument. The Commons has decided that news is a public good,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore it needs to be available to everybody, whether or not they can afford it. And that's why we have, at least up until now, remained a free newspaper. And
Well, there's
it's some.
also there's also a commercial argument for leaving it free, which is that you get more readers that way and wider distribution, and that makes the Commons more attractive to advertisers.
That is a very good point. Thank you. I forget that side. But just to bring it back, I personally support that approach, and yet I also understand that there is this conflict between the amount of infrastructure to do a really good news coverage, the
Mm-hmm.
amount of infrastructure you need, and the amount of human capital you need is more than perhaps a free paper can deliver, right? Without a lot of community support.
Yeah,
Um,
7 days has made a go of it for a long time because they are in a city that has a lot of entertainment, a lot of dining,
mhm,
a lot of events, and that's their core advertising pitch.
mhm,
They have a calendar of events that's a draw for readers. Readers
yes,
who don't even read the articles will pick it up just to have the calendar around for the rest of the week. And having the calendar around and people who are going there to look for things to do or see or go to um, will find advertising for those things. And so it's an attractive proposition. But that's in a much larger and much more sort of culturally rich market than any other community in Vermont. So
mhm.
you can't get the same kind of value proposition in Brattleboro or Hardwick,
Yes,
for instance.
yeah. I think there's more people in Burlington than there may be in all of Windham County.
Probably.
or close to it at least.
Hardwick is our biggest town and it's under 3,000 people.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
So, I guess the question for you, John, as you're diving more and more into local media and the need for it. And I do agree. I think the need for local coverage is as important as anything the national or international papers cover. You need to know where your select board's putting the tax funding. You want to know if the select board's not spending things well. Um,
But
oh,
one of my favorite genres of local reporting is local government body goes nuts.
well, those are kind of fun moments too. You go to
Yeah,
admit.
you get that. You get that once in a while, and since I read all the local weeklies I can get my hands on or find online, more to the point. I come across those and always enjoy reading them, even if I have no idea who these people are or what they're so upset about. But that's a thing that nobody would ever know. I mean, if you didn't have a local paper and you depended just on the published minutes of a meeting, you know, the arguments and the debates and the personality clashes, which are legitimate in terms of your decision making as a voter
Hmm.
about who you want holding those offices, you would never know about.
Yeah.
I there are a few papers around Vermont that don't do their jobs very well. And I am aware of times when there are tremendous controversies in a given community, and the local paper will give you absolutely nothing about them
Hmm.
because they don't want to offend the powers that be. But a good local paper is worth its weight in gold, or at least worth its weight in $10 a month or whatever you can afford to give. So give now.
Give now, give often.
Yes.
Um, and I apologize to any of the video watchers on our YouTube page. I I got caught off guard with how the sun is moving around the house, and so I apologize. I'm trying not to burn out the image too badly. Um, so I guess there's so many, as you said, so many smart people trying to solve this issue. And yes, you put the finger on the big one. We need community support, whether that's advertising, whether it's grant funding, whether it's donations or subscriptions.
Yeah.
We need that. But I guess the other question I ask, and I came to the news industry 15 years ago.
Mhm.
You have been in the news industry much longer than me, and it has changed quite a bit for both of us.
Yeah.
Um, I worry too about the industry that it needs to be a career
Yeah.
that someone can live off of and meet their goals, whether that goal is to buy a house or to have a family or whatever. Um, and I worry that the way the local media has been stripped down so much that the only people who will be able to afford to be reporters will be independently wealthy. Which is not the end of the world, but if we I think if we want a newspaper that reflects a community's multiple perspectives, it helps to have multiple perspectives in the newsroom.
Hmm. Yep. Yeah. And, if you have a newsroom like, the Hardwick Gazette's, the paid staff includes basically three part-timers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, our editor and publisher is not drawing a paycheck right now.
Hmm.
That none of that is sustainable.
No.
But we have to build more. We have to make the case. We have to learn how to make the case. This is a new skill set for print journalists. It's something that I'm more accustomed to coming from public radio, but it's a new skill set for print journalists. Some of whom bridle at the notion that they might have to be involved in raising money
Mm-hmm.
because it feels like a violation of their ethics.
I admit I can fall into that camp pretty easily.
And I can understand that. I have never felt that way because I was in public radio and I had to like read the news and then go back on the air immediately and ask people to give money.
Hmm.
And I found ways to do that that I felt comfortable with. Um, but it's just, I mean, we don't really know how to effectively raise money.
Hmm.
We don't know how to, in the case of the Gazette, it's probably going to require, you know, some ad revenue, some general reader support, either giving $50 once a year or, giving $5 or $10 a month, which some people do, and that's great. But it's also going to involve reaching out to people in the community with the means to give large amounts of money, four figures or more,
Hmm.
uh, and identifying those people and networking with those people. Um, and there are a lot of them, especially in Vermont, who are very civic minded
Hmm.
and who see the value in journalism. Um, they are out there and they are willing to support, but we are feeling our way toward, connecting with those people and bringing them into the operation. Traditional newsrooms also have been kind of set aside from the community. They are in some ways in the community, but in some ways they keep a church-state difference,
Hmm.
a distance, in order to preserve their independence.
Hmm.
If you're going to be a nonprofit, you are going to have to be a community-oriented and community-engaged enterprise.
Yeah.
And that requires a different way of dealing with your readers and your supporters.
Hmm.
Um, and it's a new skill set. And there are organizations out there. There's a lot of foundation money going into developing nonprofit journalism. And there are organizations trying to develop these programs and share skills and share resources. And that's extremely helpful. Um, there's also a lot of money being spent by large institutions on efforts that are never going to help a newspaper the size of the Commons or the Gazette, because they're at 30,000 feet and we're down in the trenches. And that's something that worries me about the whole enterprise of reinventing or inventing nonprofit journalism as a force. That's one of the issues that I'm concerned about.
Hmm.
You know, there's a lot to be concerned about, and anyone who depends on the news to inform their votes and their views of local issues um, they can't anymore just wait for the paper to show up on their doorstep or in their coffee shop or their co-op. They need to be an active part of the enterprise as well.
Hmm.
So, um, which we're coming back around to donate to your local paper.
Well,
We have at the Gazette, we have about 700 or 800 people a week we have about 1,800 people who receive our weekly email summary of what's in this week's issue.
right.
There are about 700 or 800 who just about every week click on at least one article. And those are people who depend on our paper to learn what's going on in their communities where there would otherwise be little to no news coverage at all. And, they have to realize that they need to be part of the enterprise if this is going to work.
Yeah.
So,
It's been interesting in the last several years, especially as print journalism, as far as having a physical printed
mhm.
newspaper, has diminished. There's been a lot of conversation about how do people get their news? Is it Twitter? Is it Facebook? Is it Blue Sky? Is it, fill in the blank here? And I still feel that that's an important conversation. But I think what gets lost in that conversation is everything that comes before how someone accesses the news. Like, how's the newspaper keeping the lights on?
Hmm.
how many reporters are they, able to afford, and can those reporters afford to have vacations? And a 401k would be nice. Um, and so there's just so much around the news industry that needs to be rebuilt in some way, shape, or form before we even get to whether someone's using an iPhone or a computer or an Android.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the Gazette is currently not a print publication. We put out all our news in one chunk, every Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, and we make up a PDF so that people who like to look at something that looks like a newspaper can leaf through the pages. But we would like to go back to print because there are a lot of people in our communities who don't even know the Gazette is still there because
Right,
it stopped printing and it
right.
was in their store, in their coffee shop, in their restaurant, waiting for them, in their library. Um, and also because, as we said earlier, it's a value to advertisers to have a print paper that people keep in their house and refer
Mm-hmm.
to more than once. Um, so we would like to do that. We have heard of cases where papers in other parts of the country have returned to print and made money at it, but that
Mm-hmm.
requires a robust ad sales operation,
Yeah.
which is another thing that in the good old days or the bad old days, people newspapers had entire sales staffs, and we don't have that anymore. So it's it's being creative, it's being nimble, it's being inventive, and responding to challenges as they come up, and fighting the good fight. And fortunately, there are a lot of people in local journalism who are dedicated to fighting that fight. They could make more money doing something else. They could build a 401k doing something else, but they want to report on their own communities. And so that's a great thing. It's a great thing. There are many parts of the countries where local newspapers, local weeklies have just died
Yeah.
or been swallowed up by large corporations with no interest in doing anything besides, having just barely enough content of any quality in order to support the ads that they sell.
Mm-hmm.
And we're lucky in Vermont to have as many local independent newspapers as we have.
Yeah.
Things are much worse in other areas of the country. But, it is something that requires our attention and our thoughtfulness and our support in order to make this transition into what I think would be a better nonprofit future for journalism. For-profit journalism, supposedly there was the wall between the sales and the editorial, and the wall was never as solid as it was purported to be.
Yes.
Um, so, if we can create journalism as a nonprofit enterprise that people widely value as a social good, then I think we could see an even healthier journalism industry than what we had before when, the vast majority of the income was from ad sales.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we're almost out of time, but I'll say this, one of Vermont's strengths is our sense of community,
Mm-hmm.
and that we put a lot of emphasis on preserving and protecting community. And yeah, a good, robust news environment is part of that. I mean, that's one way the community can communicate with different parts of itself.
And that also includes podcasts.
There you go. And blogs. And on that, we are out of time. But John Walters, as always, it's wonderful to have you on this show. I love our conversations. Remind folks where they can find your work.
Yeah, my blog is called The Vermont Political Observer. Its web address is just thevpo.org, thevpo.org. I'm very easy to find in the search engines and all that. So do stop by if you get a chance.
Thank you. And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW LP Brattleboro every Friday at 2 and rebroadcasted every Wednesday morning at 8:30, I believe. Also, wherever you find your podcasts, as well as BCTV. And if you want to drop me a line, you can send an email to the Montpelier Happy Hour at gmail.com. And if there's anything you're curious about, any legislation that maybe happened that you didn't understand or you want to understand better, any other topics, I'm in the process of kind of putting together my schedule for the next few months until the legislative session starts up again. So, yes, please drop me a line with anything you're curious about or you'd like to know more about, and I'll see if I can get it on the show. Take care, everyone. Have a good weekend.